September 12, 1942. Guadalcanal, just after nightfall. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson stood in the darkness on a jungle ridge 1 mile south of Henderson Field, listening to the sounds that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Somewhere in the black wall of vegetation below, 3,000 Japanese soldiers were moving into position. He could hear them, the crack of branches, the metallic clink of equipment, voices calling out in Japanese, not even bothering to stay quiet. They were that confident. Edson had 840 Marines. Raiders and paratroopers, yes, but still outnumbered more than 3 to 1. The ridge beneath his boots was the last high ground before the airfield. If the Japanese took it, they would pour artillery fire onto the runway. The aircraft that kept the island supplied would be destroyed. The 12,000 Marines on Guadalcanal would be cut off, surrounded, and annihilated. Everything came down to this single strip of coral and kunai grass. Edson turned to his men in the darkness. They were exhausted. They had been fighting for 5 weeks straight, surviving on 2 meals a day, battling malaria and dysentery alongside the enemy. Many had not slept in 36 hours. Their uniforms were rotting off their bodies in the tropical humidity. Some had lost 20 pounds since landing. Others shook with fever even as they gripped their rifles. He did not give them a speech about glory or country. He gave them the truth. "Hold 1 more night," he told them. "Just 1 more night. If we hold, we will be relieved in the morning." Then the Japanese came. What happened over the next 12 hours would mark a turning point in the Pacific War. It would shatter Japanese assumptions about American fighting spirit. It would establish the United States Marine Corps as the most feared ground force Japan would ever face. And it would begin a transformation in how the Empire of Japan thought about combat against American infantry. But to understand why this single night mattered so much, you first have to understand what the world looked like in the summer of 1942. Japan was winning. Not just winning, dominating. In the 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy had swept across the Pacific with a speed that stunned military observers worldwide. Hong Kong fell in 17 days. The supposedly impregnable fortress of Singapore surrendered in 70 days, with 80,000 British and Commonwealth troops marching into captivity, the largest surrender in British military history. The Dutch East Indies collapsed in 3 months. Burma fell. The Philippines fell. Wake Island fell. American and Allied forces had been beaten everywhere. The Japanese military had captured territory spanning 5,000 miles from the borders of India to the islands of the Central Pacific. Military analysts in Tokyo calculated that Japan now controlled resources and populations that dwarfed the home islands themselves. Oil from the Dutch East Indies, rubber from Malaya, rice from Indochina. The Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere was becoming reality. More than territory, Japanese commanders had won something equally valuable. They had convinced themselves that Western soldiers simply could not fight. This was not mere propaganda. Japanese officers genuinely believed it. They had watched British troops surrender by the tens of thousands at Singapore, many without firing a shot. They had seen American forces on Bataan hold out bravely, but ultimately collapse after months of starvation and disease. They had studied their own infantry's performance in China, where Japanese soldiers had won victory after victory against numerically superior opponents through shock, speed, and willingness to die. The conclusion seemed obvious. Asian soldiers possessed a spiritual strength that Westerners lacked. The Bushido Code, the warrior tradition stretching back centuries, gave Japanese troops an edge that no amount of American industrial production could overcome. 1 Japanese soldier was worth 10 Americans. This was simply accepted as fact by officers who would stake thousands of lives on the assumption. Japanese military intelligence reinforced this belief with analysis that bordered on fantasy. American Marines were described as prison inmates, given the choice between combat and incarceration. They were depicted as undisciplined, poorly trained, and likely to break under pressure. The few thousand Marines on Guadalcanal were estimated at 2,000 men, maybe less, poorly supplied, demoralized, ripe for destruction. Imperial headquarters in Tokyo operated on these assumptions when planning the recapture of Guadalcanal. They allocated forces that would have been adequate against the weak garrison they imagined. They never considered that reality might be different. This assessment was wrong in almost every particular, and one man understood exactly how wrong it was. Major General Alexander Vandergrift, commanding the 1st Marine Division, had no illusions about his situation. His Marines had landed on August 7th with 17 days of ammunition and food. The Navy had pulled out after heavy losses at the Battle of Savo Island, leaving Vandergrift's force isolated on an island they barely controlled. Japanese aircraft bombed Henderson Field daily, flying down from Rabaul in formations that seemed endless. Japanese warships shelled the perimeter nightly, their 14-inch shells turning the night into a nightmare of explosions and fire. Japanese reinforcements poured onto the island via high-speed destroyer runs that the Americans would come to call the Tokyo Express, delivering fresh troops under cover of darkness. Vandergrift's men were hungry. They were sick. They were surrounded by an enemy that grew stronger every week while their own supplies dwindled. The situation by any rational military assessment was desperate, but Vandergrift also knew something the Japanese did not. He knew what Marines were actually capable of. These were not convicts or conscripts. Marine recruit training lasted 13 weeks, longer than any other American service. Every Marine received 147 hours of rifle instruction at Paris Island, nearly triple what Army soldiers received. Every Marine qualified as a rifleman before learning any other specialty. This was not rhetoric. This was doctrine, established after the Commandant discovered in 1899 that fewer than 100 Marines in the entire Corps could meet marksmanship standards. Major C.H. Lauchheimer had been directed to take shooting seriously. The Corps had spent 4 decades doing exactly that. By 1942, Marine marksmanship was legendary. Qualification standards that would have marked an Army soldier as an expert barely met minimum requirements for Marines. More importantly, Marines had developed something unique in military organization. Since 1934, they had trained specifically for amphibious assault, the most difficult military operation in existence. They had written the book on it, literally. The tentative manual for landing operations, published that year, became the foundation for amphibious doctrine not just in America, but worldwide. The Navy adopted it. The Army adopted it. Even the British used it when planning their own amphibious operations. Between 1935 and 1941, Marines conducted 7 fleet landing exercises, working out doctrine for naval gunfire support, close air support, and infantry tactics against fortified beaches. They developed requirements for landing craft that could carry troops directly onto hostile shores. They trained naval officers to coordinate bombardment with infantry movements. They learned, through painful trial and error, what worked and what got men killed. No other military in the world had invested this kind of effort into storming defended shorelines. The Japanese were about to discover what that training produced. The first test came on August 21st, 2 weeks before Edson's Ridge. Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki led 917 elite Japanese soldiers across a sandbar at the mouth of the Ilu River, misidentified on American maps as the Tenaru. These were veterans of the China campaigns, hardened troops who had never known defeat. Ichiki himself was a decorated officer with years of combat experience. His regiment had participated in the conquest of Guam. They expected to sweep through the American lines in a single night. They attacked at night, screaming, bayonets fixed, absolutely certain they would shatter the Marines, as they had shattered every other enemy they had faced. The Marines were waiting. They had dug in along the west bank of the river. Machine guns covered the sandbar from multiple positions. Riflemen had registered their weapons on likely crossing points during daylight. Barbed wire stretched across the approaches. The position was not elaborate, but it was prepared. When Ichiki's men charged across the sandbar in the darkness, machine guns opened up from 3 directions. Tracers cut through the packed formations. Riflemen fired with the accuracy that hundreds of hours on the range had built into muscle memory. The Japanese charge slammed into a wall of fire and disintegrated. Wave after wave came forward. Wave after wave was destroyed. Bodies piled on the sandbar until the Japanese who followed had to climb over their own dead. By dawn, the carnage was total. M3 Stuart light tanks from the 1st Tank Battalion rolled through the Coconut Grove, where surviving Japanese had retreated, completing the destruction. Marines counted more than 800 dead Japanese soldiers on the sandbar and in the surrounding jungle. Colonel Ichiki burned his regimental colors to prevent their capture, then shot himself. American losses were 35 killed. When reports reached Tokyo, staff officers refused to believe them. The numbers had to be wrong. Japanese soldiers did not die in those ratios. It was not possible, but it was possible, and it was about to happen again. The defeat at the Tenaru was attributed to Ichiki's overconfidence. He had divided his force, attacking with only half his regiment while the rest remained behind. Tokyo reasoned that a stronger force, properly coordinated, would succeed where Ichiki had failed. Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi brought 3,000 men through the jungle to attack from the south, avoiding the coastal areas where Ichiki had been destroyed. His route took weeks to traverse, with soldiers hacking through tropical vegetation so dense that progress sometimes slowed to a few hundred yards per day. Many collapsed from exhaustion and disease before reaching the assault positions. His plan was sound. His troops were fresh compared to the Marines they would face, and he had chosen as his target the ridge where Lieutenant Colonel Edson waited with his 840 raiders. Edson understood what was coming. Intelligence had detected Japanese movements in the jungle. Coast watchers had reported the Tokyo Express delivering reinforcements. The ridge, 1 mile south of Henderson Field, was the obvious approach for any force attempting to reach the airfield through the jungle. Edson positioned his men carefully. The 1st Raider Battalion and 1st Parachute Battalion spread across a line roughly 1,000 yards long. They dug fighting holes in the rocky coral soil. They cleared fields of fire through the kunai grass. They registered artillery coordinates on likely approach routes. And they waited. The assault began at 9:30 on the night of September 12th, with a Japanese cruiser and 3 destroyers shelling the Marine positions. Shells crashed into the ridge, sending coral fragments spinning through the darkness. As the bombardment lifted, the first waves emerged from the jungle. What followed was 12 hours of combat so intense that veterans struggled to describe it for the rest of their lives. The Japanese attacked in waves, hurling themselves at the Marine lines through the waist-high kunai grass. Officers led with drawn swords, screaming commands. Enlisted men followed with bayonets fixed, some firing as they ran, others saving their bullets for close quarters. Grenades arced through the darkness, their explosions punctuating the continuous roar of rifle fire. Machine guns fired until their barrels glowed red, the gunners pouring water on the mechanisms to keep them functioning. Marines fought with bayonets when ammunition ran low, with knives when bayonets broke, with entrenching tools and bare hands when nothing else remained. The fighting was so close that men could smell their enemies, so dark that friend and foe were distinguished only by shape and sound. The center of the Marine line buckled. A company of paratroopers was nearly overrun, its commander killed, its survivors falling back in confusion. Japanese soldiers penetrated to within 1,000 yards of Henderson Field. Some reached the edge of the airstrip itself before being killed. Edson was everywhere, standing on an ammunition box in full view of the enemy, silhouetted against the flashes of artillery. He directed fire, repositioned units, and rallied men who were close to breaking. His nickname was Red Mike, earned from a beard he had worn in Nicaragua. That night he earned something more valuable. He earned the Medal of Honor. At one point, with the line collapsing and Japanese forces pouring through the gap, Edson encountered a group of Marines falling back in disorder. "Where are you going?" he demanded. "We cannot hold them," came the reply. Edson's response became legend. "By God, you will hold. Now get back there and do it." They held. By 3 a.m. on September 14th, the crisis peaked. Japanese forces had punched through the center and were pouring toward the airfield. Edson had committed every reserve. There was nothing left. The situation had reached the point where Major General Vandergrift, waiting at his command post, later admitted it was the only time during the entire Guadalcanal campaign that he doubted the outcome. Then artillery arrived. The 11th Marines had registered their guns on the ridge during daylight. Now, in the darkness, they fired mission after mission onto the Japanese assault columns. 105mm shells tore through the packed formations with devastating effect. Shrapnel scythed through men advancing shoulder to shoulder. Blast waves threw bodies through the air. The jungle erupted in continuous explosions that turned the approach routes into killing grounds. The Japanese advance stalled, then fragmented, then broke entirely. Dawn revealed the scale of the victory. More than 600 Japanese bodies lay on the ridge and in the jungle below. Some counts reached 800. Wounded Japanese soldiers had been dragged back into the jungle by their comrades, meaning the actual toll was probably higher still. Marine casualties were under 200, with fewer than 60 killed. Kawaguchi retreated into the jungle with the remnants of his brigade. Many would die of starvation and disease in the weeks ahead, unable to be resupplied, unable to be evacuated. He had started with 3,000 men. He would emerge months later with a fraction of that number. The Battle of Edson's Ridge, later called Bloody Ridge, was over. One word spread through both armies after that night. Among the Marines, it was simple. They had held. Against 3-1 odds, in the darkness, with everything at stake, they had held. It was exactly what their training had prepared them to do. Among the Japanese, the word was different. It was confusion. It was doubt. For the first time, Japanese soldiers had thrown themselves against an American position with everything they had, and they had been slaughtered. Second Lieutenant Genjiro Inui, an officer with the 8th Independent Anti-Tank Gun Company, recorded his thoughts in a diary that would survive the war. He had witnessed the aftermath of both the Tenaru and Edson's Ridge. He had seen the bodies piled on the sandbar. He had heard the survivors describe the machine gun fire that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Their firepower had overwhelmed us, he wrote. We had put too much confidence in our charging power. Only after our superior firepower can compete with their superior firepower will the charging power of the Imperial Army win a victory. This was not propaganda for home consumption. This was a professional soldier's private assessment, never intended to be read by anyone but himself. And it captured something profound. The Japanese were beginning to understand that their assumptions about American infantry were catastrophically wrong. Inui noted another revelation in his diary, one that challenged everything Tokyo believed about Marine strength. Based on the wishful thinking by the Imperial headquarters that the United States Marine Corps were about 2,000 or so, he wrote, Ichiki's force was divided up and dispatched to Guadalcanal with small arms. The reality was that 12,000 Marines held the island. Japanese intelligence had been wrong by a factor of 6, but understanding came slowly. Tokyo was not ready to accept that its soldiers were being outfought by the men they had dismissed as soft and undisciplined. More troops were sent, more attacks were ordered, more bodies piled up on Guadalcanal. The battle for Henderson Field in late October brought 20,000 Japanese soldiers against the Marine perimeter in the largest ground assault of the campaign. Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake, commanding the 17th Army, personally directed the operation. Japanese battleships bombarded the airfield with 14-inch shells on the nights of October 13th and 14th, destroying half of Marine aviation fuel and dozens of aircraft. Japanese soldiers attacked from multiple directions simultaneously, coordinating their assaults through the jungle in an operation far more sophisticated than anything previously attempted. The Marines held again. Over 3 days of combat, the Japanese suffered approximately 3,500 dead. American losses were under 300. The pattern established at the Tenaru and Edson's Ridge was repeating itself across the entire perimeter. Japanese attacks were being shattered against Marine firepower with kill ratios that defied everything Tokyo believed about infantry combat. By February 1943, the Japanese evacuated Guadalcanal. They had landed approximately 36,000 troops on the island over 6 months of desperate fighting. They had lost between 20 and 30,000 killed, with thousands more dead from disease and starvation. Marine and Army ground forces together had lost around 1,600 killed in action. The myth of Japanese military invincibility died on Guadalcanal. It died on the sandbar at the Tenaru. It died on Edson's Ridge. It died in the mud and jungle around Henderson Field, and Japanese commanders knew it. What Tokyo understood, and what took the rest of the world longer to grasp, was that Guadalcanal was not a fluke. The Marines had developed a way of fighting that the Japanese could not match. It combined rifle marksmanship, small unit tactics, and devastating supporting fires into a system that chewed through banzai charges like a meat grinder. The key innovation was the fire team structure that Marines had developed in the years before the war. Captain Evans Carlson had observed Mao Zedong's 8th Route Army in China and brought back ideas about small unit organization that the Corps adapted for its own purposes. By January 1944, Marine infantry squads consisted of 13 men organized into 3 fire teams of 4 men each. Each fire team contained a leader, an automatic rifleman carrying the Browning automatic rifle, an assistant automatic rifleman, and a rifleman. This meant 3 automatic weapons per squad. Army squads of the same period carried only 1 Browning automatic rifle. Marines could generate 3 times the automatic weapons fire at the squad level, the basic building block of infantry combat. The difference mattered. In the close-range fighting that characterized Pacific Island combat, concentrated automatic fire was decisive. A Marine squad could suppress an enemy position while maneuvering against it, using 1 fire team to pin the enemy and 2 to attack from different angles. This flexibility had been designed for amphibious assault, where units often landed fragmented and had to operate independently. It proved equally valuable in jungle warfare, where larger formations could not maintain cohesion. The war in the Pacific had changed. The question was whether Japan could adapt. The answer came over the next 3 years, written in blood across islands whose names would become synonymous with Marine sacrifice: Tarawa, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. Each campaign demanded more than the last. Each forced both sides to evolve. At Tarawa, in November 1943, the 2nd Marine Division assaulted Betio Island, a fortress of concrete bunkers and coconut log barriers, defended by nearly 5,000 elite Japanese naval infantry. Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki, the Japanese commander, had built what he considered an impregnable position. Every approach was covered by interlocking fields of fire. Underwater obstacles blocked landing craft. Heavy guns could reach any point where invaders might land. Shibasaki boasted that 1 million men could not take Tarawa in 100 years. The Marines took it in 76 hours. The cost was appalling. Nearly 1,000 Marines died, many of them wading hundreds of yards through chest-deep water under machine gun fire because their landing craft could not clear the coral reef. A rare tidal condition called an apogean neap tide had reduced water depth over the reef to barely 3 feet, grounding Higgins boats that needed 4 feet to pass. Only the LVT amphibian tractors could cross. Everyone else had to wade. More than 2,000 additional Marines were wounded. The beaches were littered with bodies. But when it was over, only 17 Japanese soldiers from the original garrison had survived to surrender. That meant 4,500 Japanese had been killed in 3 days of combat on an island smaller than Central Park. Shibasaki himself died on the 2nd day, killed by naval gunfire from American destroyers when he attempted to move his command post. His prediction about 1 million men and 100 years had been proven wrong by 18,000 Marines and 76 hours. Colonel David Shoup, who commanded the assault and continued directing operations for 36 hours after being wounded in both legs by shrapnel, received the Medal of Honor. First Lieutenant William Hawkins earned the Medal of Honor posthumously for single-handedly destroying multiple pillboxes on the first day. Shoup himself said that it was not often you could credit a first lieutenant with winning a battle, but Hawkins came as near to it as any man could. Colonel Merritt Edson, now serving as Division Chief of Staff, came ashore to assess the situation, and later observed that Marines had paid the stiffest price in human life per square yard at Tarawa than any other battle in Corps history. 4 Medals of Honor total were awarded for Tarawa. The battle shocked the American public when casualty footage reached home, but it proved that fortified islands could be taken by direct assault, and it taught lessons that would save lives in campaigns to come. At Peleliu in September 1944, the Japanese unveiled a new defensive doctrine that would make Guadalcanal's banzai charges seem almost merciful in retrospect. Colonel Kunio Nakagawa commanded roughly 11,000 defenders on an island of coral ridges and natural caves. Rather than waste his men in frontal assaults, Nakagawa placed only a single battalion as a delaying force on the beaches. His main strength hid in more than 500 caves carved into the Umabrugol ridges, which Marines would come to call Bloody Nose Ridge. Major General William Rupertus, commanding the 1st Marine Division, predicted a rough but fast battle lasting perhaps 4 days. It lasted 73 days. The 1st Marine Regiment suffered such catastrophic casualties that it was rendered combat ineffective and had to be withdrawn. Some rifle companies lost over 60% of their men in the first week. The tactics that had worked at Guadalcanal and Tarawa, suppressing enemy positions and then destroying them, failed against defenders who refused to show themselves until Marines were within grenade range. Nakagawa held out until November, sending his final message on November 24th. "Our sword is broken, and we have run out of spears," he reported. Then he burned his regimental colours and committed ritual suicide. He was posthumously promoted to lieutenant general. American casualties at Peleliu exceeded 8,000, including more than 1,500 killed. Japanese losses approached 11,000, with only a handful surviving to become prisoners. The lessons of Peleliu spread through both militaries. The Japanese had found a way to multiply the effectiveness of their defenders. The Marines had found that their existing tactics were no longer sufficient. Both would apply what they learned to the battles still to come. By 1944, Japanese military doctrine was undergoing a fundamental shift. The lesson of Guadalcanal, confirmed at Tarawa, could no longer be ignored. American Marines were not soft, they were not undisciplined, they were not going to break under pressure. Banzai charges, the massed infantry assaults that had worked in China and across Southeast Asia, were simply feeding men into a killing machine. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi was perhaps the first Japanese commander to fully absorb this lesson and act on it. Assigned to defend Iwo Jima in June 1944, Kuribayashi brought unusual qualifications to the task. He had spent time in the United States from 1928 to 1930, traveling extensively across America. He had visited Detroit and observed American industrial capacity. He had studied American military thinking. He understood his enemy in a way few Japanese officers did. More importantly, Kuribayashi had studied Tarawa with professional intensity. He knew that clinging to the myth that American infantry had no stomach for close combat was, in his own words, foolhardy. The Marines had overwhelmed a heavily fortified special naval landing force in 3 days. They had waded through fire that should have stopped them cold. They had taken casualties that should have broken them and kept attacking anyway. Kuribayashi concluded that everything about Japanese defensive doctrine needed to change. No more beach defenses. The Marines' naval gunfire and air support made coastal fortifications death traps. Positions on the beach would be destroyed before the enemy even landed. The defenders would pull back inland, into caves and tunnels where American firepower could not reach them. No more banzai charges. Every soldier who died in a pointless frontal assault